Well, I have been asking you to spend this Lenten season reading through the Gospel of Mark. I hope you've done it. If not, it's only 16 chapters, and you could do it this afternoon in the same length of time it would take you to skim through the New York Times Sunday version. So I hope you'll do it. I think you'll find that after you read through Mark, a lot of things will make sense, and it'll surely make it easy then to start reading Matthew and Luke. Today, Palm Sunday, we read from the famous 11th chapter of Mark, pretty close towards the end of our trip to the cross. In fact, we'll finish today at the foot of the cross. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a coat that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. And if anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it back here immediately.'" They went away and found a coat tied near a door outside in the street. And as they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing untying this coat?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the coat to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Then Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he looked around at everything as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. This is the word of the Lord. My father-in-law fought with the legendary 36th Division during World War II. Like a lot of men who saw a lot of heavy combat, he never talked about it until his final years. He joined the Army at age 19. So all of those years, he carried those memories. The 36th Division, a lot of you know that story. They sailed to North Africa, landed in North Africa, then they sailed to Italy, landed at places called Anzio and Salerno. Moved up into the interior, he fought at Montesino. Some of the truly great and legendary battles of World War II. He came home with 5 battle stars, 5 major battles. When he started opening up to me in the later years of his life, he said something to me one day that I will never forget. He said, "Don, I was 19 years old when I enlisted." And he said, "We all thought that we would go over there to Europe and whip the Germans and be back within a matter of months, less than a year." And then there came this moment in the middle of a winter, surrounded by ice and mud and snow, in the middle of a foxhole. And I came to the realization that I would never, ever make it back home. We'd lost about a third of our unit. And he said there wasn't a single man amongst us who at that point believed we would make it back home. I thought about that conversation this past week as I was reading through Mark, especially as I came to this story about Palm Sunday, because you see, that really is the story of the disciples as they were getting ready to enter Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. They'd followed Jesus all of these years, and one thing they knew, Jesus was on the side of God. And so they thought, well, of course, we're on the side of God. And they believed with all of their hearts that they would enter into Jerusalem like a conquering army, that Jesus would there in Jerusalem set up his earthly kingdom, that they would be a part of the glory of this particular day, and that the most difficult thing that would be demanded of them would be a victory lap. If you want proof of this, all you have to do is turn back to the 10th chapter, one chapter earlier than this. It's a wonderful story about James and John. James and John were brothers, the sons of Zebedee. They were 2 of the leading disciples for Jesus. And they were on the way to Jerusalem. And they realize that this is kind of the final showdown. And so at one point as they're walking along, James and John kind of move up to the front of the line with Jesus, and they pull him aside. One's on one side and the other's on the other side. They said, Jesus, we have a favor to ask of you. And he says, what is it? And they said, when you come into your kingdom, we'd like to sit on each side of you, one on the right and one on the left. And Jesus looked at them and said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the same cup that I'm about to drink? And without even thinking about it, they said, yes, of course we can. They believed that Jesus would be on a throne, an earthly throne, one of them on the right and one of them on the left. And so as the disciples come into Jerusalem on this particular morning, if you'd asked them, everything was going according to plan. Everything was great. People were laying out their cloaks and the palm branches. They were waving Jesus in. They were crying, Hosanna. They thought this is the time, almost the time for the victory lap. It never occurred to them that this would be the time when they would have to make terrible, terrible choices. And of course, the reason for that is that we never think about having to make difficult choices as human beings, do we? You know, life is seductive like that. Life is very seductive like that. When we start making plans, we almost invariably plan for the best, don't we? That's just what we do as human beings. For instance, you graduate from high school, you graduate from college, you have that degree, you get ready to go to work, you get that first job. And you know what you're thinking. You're not doing risk management. You're not thinking about what is the worst that could happen here. You're dreaming about how great your career is going to be, right? You're thinking about that nifty little corner office in the corporate suite. It never occurs to you to think about the fact that maybe one day, 15 or 20 years from now, that company may go belly under. Or that you might be the person selected to enforce the reduction in force. Or you might be the person caught in the reduction in force. It's just the way we are as human beings. When we start planning out our life, we plan for the best. We rarely think about the worst that can happen. Same thing is true with marriage. You meet the right girl, the right guy, and you start thinking, you fall in love, you think this is the perfect person. We're going to live and be happy ever after, right? There's so much divorce in our country these days. There are people who really are aware of that, especially they are, had parents that were divorced. A lot of us are like that. And so a lot of times when people come to be married these days, they're thinking about that. I want to make sure this works. I don't want it to end in divorce. Nevertheless, most people really don't think through the long-term consequences, the ups and the downs. It says, till death do us part, right? In sickness and in health, till death do us part. What does that mean? When you get ready to get married, you think and plan for the best. You don't think about old age, infirmities, the hospital visits, living with someone maybe that has dementia. My wife complains about that some these days. That's who we are as human beings. We plan for the best, not for the worst. You decide to have children. And it's kind of like woe begone. You think our children will always be better than average, right? You think about the birthday parties, you plan college, perfect. You don't think about the illness or the accident or the phone call in the night. Don't think about the possibility of the drugs, having to pick them up at the county jail. In the midst of all of our hopes and dreams for life, we know only too well that life happens, and life isn't always easy, and it isn't always pretty. And so that's what happened to the disciples on this particular day. They had it all figured out. Jesus was on the side of God. They were on the side of Jesus. Therefore, they were on the side of God. And everything's going to really work out well today. We're just going to go to Jerusalem to take the victory lap. And it started out well on that day. The palms were flying, the cloaks being laid in the middle of the road for Jesus to walk across. But by the end of the week, there were choices to be made. Very tough choices. For instance, the crowd. They didn't anticipate the crowd. They anticipated the crowd on Palm Sunday at the beginning of the week. People crying, "Hosanna, Hosanna, Jesus who comes in the name of God." They didn't anticipate the crowd on Good Friday. The ones who cried, "Crucify him. Crucify him." And I have to tell you, I've been preaching this passage for over 40 years now, and every year I wonder about this. Were the disciples there in the crowd? I don't know, had they already gotten scared and kind of, slipped out of town by that point? Or were they in the crowd? And how did they react when everybody around them was crying, "Crucify him, crucify him"? Did they join in? Did they say, "Crucify him"? Did they just keep their mouths quiet? Did they kind of say, "No, no, 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 something's wrong here"? Those kids on the bus the other day, they're just kids. Have you thought about that? What would you have done had you been on that bus? It's pretty tough when you get in the middle of the crowd and everybody's crying, "Crucify him." There is the story of Peter. You know it well. He had a choice to make. There was that moment when he was talking with Jesus, and Jesus said, "Peter, before you know it, you will turn around and you will desert me. You will run as fast from me as you possibly can." And Peter said, "No way. I will never desert you, even if it takes me to my death." But we see him there that night by the campfire. Jesus has been taken by the authorities. He's being questioned by the authorities. And Peter's trying to be unrecognizable, shall we say, standing around the campfire. And an older woman, a maid, a servant woman says, "You're one of them, aren't you? You're one of them. You're a Nazarene. You're a follower of Jesus." And Peter says, Who? I don't know a man named Jesus." And it happened 3 times. It happened 3 times so that Peter could be thoroughly humiliated. "I don't know the man. I don't know the man. I do not know who you're talking about." And all of a sudden, Peter realized that he had made his choice. And then the story we usually don't talk about, James and John. You remember I talked about a minute ago? They come up alongside of Jesus on the side of the road. They said, "Jesus, may we be at each side, the right and the left, when you come into your kingdom." They were envisioning an earthly kingdom sitting by the throne. And Jesus says, "You do not know what you are asking." What do you suppose it was like to be James and John at the foot of the cross, and to see who it was that was at his right and at his left as he came into the kingdom of God? They had made their choice, hadn't they? And then today I want to end talking about someone who was such a part of the story, and yet nobody ever talks about her. Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's a wonderful scene in the Gospel of Luke. You know it well. When you come here on Christmas Eve, we usually read this story about Mary in the 2nd chapter of Luke. And the baby Jesus has been born, and she's there in the manger, and we usually see her kneeling in the dirt or sitting there, rocking her baby boy. And I'll never forget what Dr. Fred Craddock said about that scene from Luke. He says, "It is amazing to think about this, but at this moment in history, The one person who knows more about God than any other human being who ever lived is a 15-year-old girl. And now, we fast forward 33 years, and we see Mary again. Now we see her at the foot of the cross, on her knees. The drops of blood falling into the soil in front of her. And she hears the anguished cries of the boy she once cradled in her arms. And we have to say the same thing. This is the one who knows more about God than any human being who ever lived. And what do you suppose she was thinking in that moment? Was she thinking about the things that concern you and me when we start talking about religion and theology? I don't think Mary would have given 2 cents for all of our arguments about whether or not the world was created in 7 days or 7 million years. I don't think Mary could have cared one bit about creationism versus evolution. I don't think Mary would have been one bit concerned about whether the Bible is inerrant, every T crossed, every I dotted, or whether there's symbolism or other kinds of powerful stories in the Bible. She wouldn't have cared. We see Mary there kneeling in the dirt, the drops of blood falling to the soil in front of her, and there is only one thing that occupied Mary's mind and heart and spirit in that moment. And that was the hope that there is a God whose love is big enough, that there is a God whose power is great enough, that even this moment can be redeemed. A God whose love is so powerful that he can bring victory out of death, joy out of defeat. And let me tell you this. If by chance you are searching for faith, for that kind of powerful, life-changing faith, don't stand in the parade on Palm Sunday very long. But find yourself at the foot of the cross, next to Mary, and see what kind of God you find in that place.